Our mission, and we choose to accept it, is zero injuries and zero environmental impact. A healthy workforce and environment is key to our nation's continued success. The Mission Zero podcast is a deep dive with the industry's top experts into the health, safety, and environmental aspects of today's workplace. Our mission is to be a platform for new ideas and strategies that, when implemented, will improve our safety, our environment, and how we govern out business. We are making the world safer, and we're going to have fun doing it.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to a new episode of the Mission Zero podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Peoples. Today, I'm in sunny and beautiful Denver, Colorado. My guest today is Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy. I have to keep trying to not say Liberty Oilfield anymore, but the CEO of Liberty Energy, one of the most, I would say, advanced speakers on the quality of energy to our lives, how it's improved our lives, and how much we need it in this world. And I've appreciated his candor over the years in that form. And welcome back, Chris. It's nice to talk to you again.
Great to see you, Jeff, and great to be back.
Thank you. I guess where we left off last time, you had just released the report, the ESG report. You had talked about a lot of things. One thing I saw in particular, the poverty net zero, and you wrote about that. One of the things I love to talk about in the energy discussion is outside of the normal parameters. Somebody's making an intellectual case for why we need fossil fuel energy. And you and Alex Epstein, I think, are the two people in this world that have finally taken the intellectual approach to describing this and doing this. So when you say poverty net zero, what do you mean by that?
Well, net zero poverty.
Yeah, net zero
everybody's saying net zero 2050 with emissions. Yeah. And as you've heard me say, I think that's a bad goal. Not only is it not achievable, but the only way to achieve it is sort of a road to impoverishment and de-energizing of society, which will hurt everyone. But of course, it'll hurt low-income people far more than it'll hurt high-income people.
Yeah.
So I set out, made a short video and said, look, what's a real goal? Goals should be achievable, maybe stretches, but achievable. And you should be thrilled if you achieve that goal. So I suggested our goal should be net zero poverty 2050. And by 2050, I think with reasonable, sober policies, we should be able to get rid of destitution, sort of complete very low levels of poverty where people are struggling to make their next meal. They're not sure if they're going to wake up the next morning. That's an achievable goal. We're always going to have relative differences in income. We're always going to have people that make more than other people. So we're always going to have people that say they're poor. But we still have today about 700 million people around the world that are really on the edge of they're destitute. Yeah. They're malnourished. They're one bad happening away from death. And that used to be the normal human condition. 90% of humanity lived in that condition for a long time. We've reduced that to about a little less than 10% today. Let's get that to zero by 2050. We ought to be able to do that. That's an admirable goal I think we should all get behind.
How much of the improvement on it, and I've done the research myself about poverty, and especially in countries like India and China, and in your ESG report for Liberty, you had a chart there. You had the data that said that, look, this corresponds directly with energy usage, that China and India had reduced poverty by several folds over, maybe by 70% or something like that, and it was directly aligned with cheap energy. And how much do you agree that cheap energy is maybe the largest factor in reducing poverty globally?
It's the only road out of poverty. There is no one that has emerged from poverty without a significant increase in their consumption of energy. I mean, as you know from our name, I think two things have really created the modern world where we have so many people living in relatively well-off conditions. That's bottom-up social organization, human liberty, markets, property rights, these things that allow people to get wealthier. But when you get wealthier, it necessarily and always involves increased consumption of energy.
Yeah. People tend to, if they never knew, they tend to forget capitalism was created for poor people. It wasn't created for rich people. It was created for poor people to find a way out of poverty. And it has done that. And I know capitalism, along with the increased energy uses of cheap energy, We see energy prices going higher. Gas, people are filling it at the pump. What are you attributing to that now? What's causing it? I know Saudi Arabia has been announced some cuts recently. Is that part of the increase in global prices?
Yes. I mean, look, recently, COVID threw a big monkey wrench in the world, right? We shut down the societies or wealthy societies, reduced energy consumption, shrunk global trade. So that took oil prices, down deeply. And then coming back out of COVID, what's been the problem? Well, demand has come back strongly. Remember, BP came out and said, maybe 2019, that's going to be peak ever demand for energy. There were a lot of pronouncements that we're going to come back transitioned. We're not going to need hydrocarbons anymore. We're going to accelerate this energy transition coming out of it. So that kind of naive beliefs that somehow the several 5 billion people are walking around in hand-washed clothes. More than half of humanity doesn't have a washing machine to save time and wash their clothes. Mm-hmm. It's just, I think, naive or evil or some combination of the two to believe they should never have washing machines. They should never have access to electricity. They should never have modern medicine. Like, Jeff, you and I know that isn't going to happen, and we don't want that to happen. And we simply don't have meaningful substitutes for oil, gas, and coal today. We have other technologies that are really derivatives of hydrocarbons that produce other kinds of energy, mostly in the electricity sector. But they're not replacements in any way for hydrocarbons. But that sort of attitude, that sort of belief has led to underinvestment in our sector. Heck, we inaugurated a new president who, the day he got inaugurated, said he wasn't going to issue any more permits on federal land. And I could go into all the other things, but all of them are a piece of one whole, which is we're going to make it harder to produce oil and gas in the United States. So think about that. Let's just reflect on that. We're the largest oil producer in the world, the largest natural gas producer in the world, the largest natural gas liquid producer, of which propane and clean cooking fuel is one. We're by far the largest producer of that. So if the biggest producer of all of these life-enabling products says we're going to make it harder to produce them here, there's an obvious result of that. You're going to get less production than you otherwise would get. And if you reduce the supply of something without changing the demand for it, you get higher prices.
Sure.
So we've been on a policy perspective to try to drive up the price. I mean, it's never stated that way. Oh, it's not to drive up the oil and gas. It's somehow if we produce less oil, somehow magically, that'll lead to other energies seamlessly filling that gap.
And you don't have to speak too much on politics, but what do you think is behind that? What is the ultimate reason that we're trying to kill? Is it because of they truly believe it's the climate, or do you believe it's something else?
I think it's complicated.
Yeah.
Most politicians or activists that are very passionate about this topic, and I engage with a lot of them, most of them don't know that much about climate change. They don't know what the mechanism for warming is. They don't know how much greenhouse gases have gone up. They believe storms are wildly more frequent and bigger today. They aren't.
Yeah.
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change covers that. Our Bettering Human Lives report covers that. Like, these are just facts that they're unaware of. Yeah. So my first sort of reaction is, I don't think it's a deeply held, passionate belief backed by research that climate change is the greatest threat to humanity. It's nowhere near the greatest threat to humanity if you look at data or numbers. So I think it's something else. And my suspicion is it's a number of different factors. When I speak in schools, for most kids, it's a meaning thing. It gives them a purpose. It gives, it's like a North Pole for them.
Yeah.
There's a problem in the world. The world is at great risk. I'm going to be virtuous and do something to help the world. There's the angels that are doing the right things. There's the devils that are doing the wrong things that are the threat. It's mostly a religion. It's sort of a modern religion.
Yeah.
Society is rapidly secularized, and that leaves a hole, right? Your kid, just having a new iPhone or a bigger bike, that isn't going to give you meaning or purpose in your life, Jeff. I love your word there, purpose. Yeah. So I think for the young, I think it's they want to make the world a better place. They want to have a meaningful life. They want to do something great. I think it comes from all the right places.
Yeah.
But it just sort of fills this vacuum. Here's your religion. Here's your purpose in life. For politicians, What do politicians do? They control the levers of power in a government. You and I, Jeff, we were just talking about, we're growing our businesses. We're proud of that. We love to do it. Heck, if you're a politician, if you want to grow your business, it means bigger government.
Yeah.
We got to control some more stuff. We got to move some resources from these people over here that we don't like so much or that are politically unpopular to these people over here that are politically important to us. So it's a reason for more power and a greater role for government. For universities, again, it's the great funder of research. When I was a grad student at MIT, it was the Department of Defense that was the funder for basic research or new technology. Today, climate change is the biggest source of sort of money. I talk to professors in universities, and they're working on the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, a long-term ocean circulation current that causes change in drought and precipitation. It's a very fascinating and important phenomenon. But if they write that this is about the PDO, they're not going to get funded. But if it's about climate change and its impacts on humans, they can get funding.
I could be totally off base, but one thing I think it's just a certain group of wealth that wants to that money that's going to come from energy. They just want it to switch to what they have. They own these companies, and they want them. They're not going to get money from oil and gas companies because outside of the United States, they're primarily state-owned companies, right? They're never going to capture that money if it's carbon because Shell is state-owned. Saudi Arabia is state-owned. They're all state-owned. I think it's a lot to do with that. And of course, I believe you're absolutely right about the lost generation. They don't have a purpose. They latch on to causes, and they're emotionally manipulated. And you see things like, I don't know if you're probably not online as busy as you are, but there is a giant uptick in climate change panic this year because we're having a hot year. We're having an incredibly hot year. I don't know how many times you've been down to Texas, but it's the worst I've ever seen, to be quite honest. But there's no pattern to that. The last few years have been really normal. So I guess the next question I would ask you. Go ahead.
Let me follow up on that, Jeff. So one thing I want to ask you correct. So Shell is not state-owned. It's a private company. It was originally started as a Dutch company that merged with a UK company. But it's a private company. But it is sort of being imposed. There was a lawsuit in the Netherlands that's sort of driving its behavior a little bit from outside. But it's a private business. But Jeff, you make the key point. The majority of oil and gas resources in the world and the majority of oil and gas production in the world is not from private businesses. Yeah. It's from state-owned government enterprises. That the Russian producers are owned by the government. The Saudi company is owned by the government. About 10% is floated publicly. But they're almost all the large production are state government entities that produce oil and gas. So is there a profit motive also in this energy transition? Well, of course, there's a profit motive in everything. Yes. Are there economic interests aligned with huge subsidies to develop wind farms and solar panels and other ways to make money? Of course, there always is. But that's not enough to drive the mania that you and I have seen over the last 10 or 20 years. So it's a combination of all of these factors. Do I worry about that monetary one? I do. I always say to people, it's not a risk to oil and gas. Oil and gas powered the world when I was born, and they'll power the world when I'm dead. And it doesn't matter how many wind farms you build or solar farms you build. They feed into the electricity sector, which is 20% of global energy, and they really can't get maybe beyond 40% of that. They likely never leave single digits in total energy. They aren't threats to oil and gas consumption, broadly speaking, but they're threats to our economy. Because if you make electricity more expensive here, you're just going to export your industry. Stuff is going to be manufactured in some other country with lower cost, more reliable electricity and energy. Europe is sort of poster child of that. They're way down the road of just exporting their energy intensive manufacturing outside of Europe. I don't want that to happen in the United States. That lowers blue collar incomes. That lowers opportunities for people across the educational spectrum in our country. I'm adamantly against that. Not because it's a threat to our industry per se, but it's a threat to our society and it's a threat to our way of life. But if you have large economic interests that are counting on monies, it is hard to reverse directions. Yeah. I think, and I don't know if we want to get into this, but the Inflation Reduction Act, that's nominally just a third of $1 trillion of subsidies for, and I think Joe Manchin supported it because, well, this isn't going to hurt the hydrocarbon industry. It's just subsidies for these other guys. And what's wrong with giving them some subsidies? The problem is we've had 20 years of subsidies there, and it's always supposedly about to be cost break even, so it won't need subsidies. But those subsidies, they're not a third of $1 trillion. That was a scenario. They're uncapped. It's likely going to be well over $1 trillion of government subsidies that'll draw in trillions of dollars of private capital that now gets a reasonable return when paired with those subsidies and the mandates. So this will change behavior and will ultimately, I think, degrade the quality of the U.S. electricity grid. I think now we're more rapidly down that road of making electricity more expensive and less reliable in this country. This, I think, is bad for our society. It's bad for economic mobility. It's deeply inequitable. Not that it's a threat to oil and gas demand, but it's wrong for our society. I'm against that.
You know, and you spoke in your report, it was more than just our society, right? One of the, as we mentioned earlier, the key factors of coming out of poverty is cheap energy. And right now, because of these, I guess, the trend towards climate change, reactionary policies or whatever, these countries, these poor countries are not getting, they're not getting licenses. They're not getting help with the refineries. They can't build refineries, right? And so you've got a woman, and I think I got this from your thing. You got a woman who in Africa who spends 2.5 to 3 hours a day just to find clean water. So going beyond, okay, she doesn't have the electricity to cook and clean in her house. She now doesn't have the time to proactively think, to become an engineer, to become an architect. Looking at it that way, oil unleashes brain power because it saves you time. Energy to me, like if you, like I said, washing clothes. If you hand wash clothes, that's hours. If you put it in a wash machine, it's 10 minutes. And so, cheap energy to me would be an enormous plus in the world ingenuity in unlocking a lot of people's brain power and creativity that currently do not have that time, right? So, and another thing I wanted to follow up on is I guess the misinformation that's out there. The storms. You mentioned that earlier. So many people. Storms are less. Fires are less. Is that true as well?
Yeah, acres burned annually from wildfires. We have pretty good global data for about 30 years. It's declined about 25%, so it's a steady decline over the last 30 years. We have pretty good data in the U.S. for over 100 years. And our Smokey the Bear campaign in the 50s and 60s led to just a plummeting in burned acres in the U.S. But then we for quote environmental reasons, we made it harder and harder to manage federal lands for cleaning out underbrush, for controlled burns, and essentially managing forests. So we've had a rise in wildfire and acres burned in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years, still far below what they were before the active campaigns to put out wildfires. So they're lower than they were, but in the U.S., they're higher than they were 20 or 30 years ago, entirely for forest management reasons. But globally, acres burned, as you just said, yes, has been on we have good data for 30 years, and it's been declining throughout those 30 years, and no reason to believe that decline won't continue. That's human activities.
What are some of the, we probably all know the different alternatives, and you said they're mostly being moved along by the government subsidies currently. What are some of the downsides to, say, wind power and I guess wind and electric cars? That's the most aggressive thing that I guess policy seems to be following. Let's get everybody in electric cars. I think California has maybe a 2035 mandate for no gasoline cars, which to me, I just can't get it. I guess I'd ask you, how would the grid work? How are we figuring that out? How is the energy supplied for these things? And also negativity. One thing we hear about is the human toll and the environmental toll on the mining of products necessary for these vehicles and these types of things. Can you just kind of go through what you think is the downside and that people may not understand?
I will, and Jeff, just quick background. And I know you know, look, I've spent my whole life fascinated by energy. I specifically went to MIT to work on fusion energy. I worked on solar energy at UC Berkeley, and I worked on geothermal energy also in my 20s, next generation geothermal. So I don't care where energy comes from. I just wanted affordable, reliable, and better human lives. Today, Liberty, we own part of a next generation geothermal company. We're excited about that company called Fervo. We can use hot underground rocks that, if they're near to the surface, to almost economically produce firm, low-carbon energy. Firm meaning 24 hours a day. Whether the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, we can produce electricity by converting heat from underground into electricity. Super interested in the nuclear space. I spoke at the National Nuclear Conference this year, surveyed all of the small modular reactor companies. We are partnering with one of them. So look, Liberty is about energy and about making people's lives better and spreading affordable, reliable energy around the world. So there are alternatives, alternative is the wrong term. There's additional energy sources beyond hydrocarbons. Top of that is nuclear. But I think next generation geothermal is going to have a role too. But of course, those are politically popular.
Well, so let me ask you to expand on nuclear. Why is nuclear, I guess, why did we abandon it? I know fear, we had disasters in the 70s that put a fear in people's minds about it. And I grew up that way as well. But I guess the one thing I heard is that it's a 10-year process just to get one built is pretty much the huge downside to it. But what do you think the reason why we haven't supported that as a government or society?
Yeah, fear is an incredibly powerful political force, maybe the most powerful political force. If you can scare people, you can direct action. You can change things. Why is climate change now called a crisis? Because if something's a crisis, it's not a rational thought about evaluating trade-offs. It's action now. We're in crisis. Yeah. So that wording, that and of course that's what's hampering our industry now. But the nuclear has had the same thing, but much worse. Yeah. It's easier to scare people about radiation that you can't see or you can't understand. So yes, nuclear has always had opposition based on fear. Now, the track record of nuclear has been fantastic. That the safety, it's the safest form of energy production for negative impacts on human lives. Nuclear is the top of the list. So, but yeah, 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in I think 86, Fukushima. These are three world news changing events. You look at it in all of them. In Fukushima, magnitude 9 earthquake, floods a giant nuclear power plant. No one died from radiation. 2 people drowned because the diesel generators were in the basement. And there was a forcible evacuation of people away. And there were deaths from that. Elderly, poor health people forced to move. I think history is probably going to judge that as a mistake, an overreaction. Yeah. The elevated radiation levels were not that high and probably were not meaningful threats to human health. So nuclear has suffered from fear, and the response to fear is government protections and layers of bureaucracies. And so, yes, it's been hard to develop nuclear in the U.S. I think that's changing. I think there's an emerging bipartisan consensus that, hey, if you want to have lower carbon energy, this is the energy-dense, reliable, dispatchable form. So I think we're going to see the pendulum swing on nuclear. But to your point, it's going to be slow. There's going to be huge opposition to it. 10 years from now, is it going to have a meaningfully different share of global energy? Unfortunately, probably not. China's building nuclear reactors. India's building reactors. Other places will. But last comment on nuclear. Nuclear is also today used almost entirely in the electricity sector. 20% of global energy is delivered via electricity. 80% is delivered in other forms for other purposes. Okay. So but the most important piece, the most important use of energy, industrial usage, and in broader terms, to make things. About half of all global energy consumption is to make things. I talked in last year's Bettering Human Lives about the 4 key materials we make: steel, cement, fertilizers, and plastics, the 4 pillars of the modern world. We use as much energy just to make those 4 materials as the energy delivered by the entire electricity sector. And they're not made using meaningful amounts of electricity. In fact, 25 years ago, about 15% of all the energy used to manufacture things came from electricity. Today, 25 years later, a little less than 15%. No change. It's hard to electrify manufacturing, because the most important ingredient is high temperature process heat.
Yeah.
Thinking of melting metals, processing things. To make silicon, polysilicon for solar panels takes incredibly high temperatures to melt and purify silicon. So even wind turbines and solar panels are very energy intensive to make them and very hydrocarbon intensive to make them, because you need high temperature process heat that today we only can get from hydrocarbons. More than half of that could come from nuclear down the road, high temperature heat from nuclear plants. I'm all for that. We still don't have a clear nuclear pathway to get to the highest temperature process heat to make polysilicon, for example. The only vision we have right now is that's coming from hydrocarbons. And in China, where most polysilicon is made, it's dominantly from burning coal and, of course, abetted shamefully by slave labor in Xinjiang.
Yeah.
So no energy technology is clean or green and has no impacts. Every energy production technology has trade-offs and impacts. And you talked about the different trade-offs. One of the limiters, I think, of wind and solar is they take maybe 10 times more materials to produce the same amount of energy from hydrocarbons. So steel, concrete, metals, polysilicon. So they're very materials, therefore energy intensive to make the systems themselves. And then they use a lot of land, about 100 times lower energy density on land usage. So you see, you know, there's 300 some rejected permits for wind farms in the U.S. It's harder to permit a wind farm than it is to get new oil and gas well permits because the impact is so much smaller. Yeah. Oil and gas uses less land, impacting less people. You know, you've got to have tens of thousands of acres for a wind farm of just modest size. So that's a lot. You know, they're in rural areas, but that's a lot of people impacted. So wind and solar, look, solar, I think, is going to be a long-term player in the global energy system. It's probably not going to be huge, but it's going to be meaningful, I think, in the long run. Wind, in my personal view, we probably see peak wind when the subsidies are no longer rolled over. That may be in the next 10 years, that may be 20 years from now. But there's just so much materials, so much land for sort of an intermittent, you don't know when it's going to be there and when it's not going to be there resource. So what's the answer to that? Right now it's natural gas. When the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, all the electricity comes from natural gas or coal or other sources.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the biggest, and we'll move on from this after this, but isn't the biggest difference between, say, hydrocarbons and wind and solar is storage of it, correct? You can't really store the energy. Am I wrong about that?
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
Hydrocarbons are lucky because they have this high energy density, less materials, less land to get a large amount of energy, and they come in their own storage packets. Yeah. They essentially hydrocarbons are stored solar energy from stuff that lived on the earth, powered by solar energy, got dyed and buried, and now they're in these packets. So you can store it. Yeah. The answer to that has been that this sort of popular political answer is batteries. The same thing of electric cars. Hey, if we can just store this energy in batteries, then, well, when it's at night, we can use the solar energy by discharging the batteries. The problem there is batteries are very expensive. So all the batteries we have on the planet today can store about 1.5 minutes of electricity. And if everyone meets their aggressive goals, which is unlikely, by 2030, we'll have enough batteries on the planet to store 10 minutes of electricity. Well, when you have a storm or a cold winter, the Dunkelflaut, as the Germans will say, you get a week in Europe in the wintertime where it's cold and dark and still. So you don't get wind or solar. Well, we might store 10 minutes. We're not going to store 10 days. So batteries, I think, just don't seem to have a pathway to be this sort of large-scale energy storage. They're going to play roles in peak shaving, and they help manage the grid on a short-term timescale, but they don't seem to have prospects for long-term energy storage.
Okay, very good. One question, I guess I would like to see how you would answer this question. For a true believer that says, okay, well, if we don't stop oil, if we don't start carbon usage right now, the Earth is going to warm by, I've seen the largest 2 degrees, or is that what you've seen as well?
2 sort of an extrapolation. We've warmed a little more than 1 degree C. You know, we're warming at about 0.15 degrees C per decade. We'll probably hit 2 degrees of warming, you know, when our grandchildren are having kids. But the IPCC will project positive feedback cases. You can get 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees of warming by the end of this century. Doesn't look likely, but not impossible.
Well, what do you think? What would, I guess a good question is, what if we stopped using carbon products? What would be the difference? Would it stop that warming, or what is your opinion on that? I know you've studied this ad nauseum and know this to the back of your head, but what would be the effect there? I mean, would it be? We know it'd be economically destroyed.
Yeah, well, the biggest difference in less than 2 years, half of us would be dead.
Yeah.
Just from food production. If you stop using natural gas, you don't produce synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. Over 50% of global food production comes from that one input. So, of course, it would not just impoverishment, widespread death within a few years. So, but I know your question's separate than that.
Yeah.
So, carbon dioxide's residence time in the atmosphere is relatively long. But if you stopped emitting new CO2 into the atmosphere, the human-caused warming impact would curtail pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah.
Now, the planet started warming about 150 years ago at the end of the Little Ice Age.
Sure.
So what we don't know, so we know the warming from, say, 1880 to 1940, we didn't meaningfully change atmospheric CO2 during that time period. So
but that
warming was a natural.
Yeah.
So since then, maybe a third of the warming we've had in the last 100-some years was then. Mm-hmm. That other 2/3 of warming, we don't know how much is caused to increase CO2 in the atmosphere or a continuation of a natural trend. I'm sure it's some combination of the two, mm-hmm. Even if we assume it's dominantly from greenhouse gas additions to the atmosphere. So maybe we've caused 3/4 of a degree of warming. But the economics, the trade-offs. So at the current rate, if we kept burning hydrocarbons right now and we kept warming at the same rate we are, little more than 2 degrees C warming at the end of this century, that's in sort of center case of the economic cases the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change looks at. That would reduce per capita GDP at the end of this century by about 1%. And if we stopped all hydrocarbons today, and so we didn't add that additional, say, 1 degree of warming, we just had a little less than 1 degree of warming otherwise, that's maybe a wash, maybe reduces economic output a hair. But the difference with or without hydrocarbons in these two cases is about 1% of per capita income at the end of this century. The economic models used assume we continue economic growth and we could continue economic progress. And so it basically means our kids are going to be 350% richer today or 346.5% richer than today. And the immeasurably small economic impact if you just take the sort of middle ground of the economic work done on climate change. Mm. So it's pretty small, slow moving from our best guesses. We don't know the future, but that's our best guesses. But we do know if you make energy more expensive or less reliable tomorrow or next year or end it in a year or two, the impacts will be catastrophic on human health, lives, and economic well-being.
Yeah. I think what a lot of people don't factor in is that, it'll be bad for the first world. It'll be bad for the Western world, but it's going to be really worse for countries in Africa, Asia, and some South American countries that are third, a growing economy, developing economies, whatever you want to call them, because if they can't afford it, they're going to stay living in the 1800s. They're not going to get out of it. Liberty in itself has grown. You're no longer Liberty Oilfield Service, Liberty Energy, as you mentioned. You mentioned the geothermal, which is a growing thing. I see it grow in Canada. It's becoming a thing in Canada quite a bit. Outside of that, since I talked to you, that was 2 years ago, something like that last. What are some things that, and I know you're constantly pushing for it, but what are some things that Liberty, some technologies, things that Liberty has done to improve their impact on the environment?
So the biggest thing I would say we're most excited about, because to me it impacts sort of all aspects. The biggest plus of it is reducing the cost of producing energy. It also reduces local air pollutants, which are immediate and real human impacts. We talked about that last time.
Yeah.
If you're cooking your meal burning wood indoor, that is deadly. So clean air is critically important. And then maybe third on my list of benefits from this technologies I'm going to talk about is it reduces greenhouse gas emissions as well. I'll count that. I think that's a positive, but it's just nowhere near as big of a positive as reducing the cost of energy and reducing local air pollution that impacts human health near our operations. And that is this movement from in our frac fleets from burning diesel to burning natural gas. So, 15 years ago, all operations were powered by diesel. Diesel, sort of the workhorse fuel. All mining operations around the world were almost entirely powered by diesel. But there was a movement with technology and with investment to move more of that diesel consumption to natural gas consumption, which again burns cleaner. Natural gas is much, much cheaper than diesel, both because the world has far more natural gas than it has oil. And oil, when you produce it, you've got to refine it to produce diesel. Like diesel is an awesome fuel. I don't want to badmouth it. But when there's applications where you can use natural gas, which is far more plentiful than oil, so cheaper than oil, and you don't need to process it very much. Natural gas is just methane. To run our frac fleets, maybe we got to knock out the ethane or propane, a little bit of liquids that are mixed in with it. So less processing, more abundant, cheaper fuel.
Does it, and I've noticed that technology is out there. Are you actually using the gas that's coming out of the ground on site, or are you processing it somewhere else and bringing it in?
Both. Okay. Most of it today is tapping a local pipeline that's, in the oil field you're in and getting already processed natural gas, compressed natural gas into a trailer, and then bringing that to location. Instead of a truck full of diesel, it's a truck full of compressed natural gas. But we're also today, and I think in the future you'll see more, where we're taking what's called field gas, so gas produced either on that well pad or right nearby. So it's just gas coming out of the ground. A simple separator, put the water here, the oil there, and then all the natural gas, including the liquids over here. And then we have a little processing system on location that knocks out those liquids, puts them into a tank so they can be trucked away and sold as propane for petrochemicals or remote heating of your houses or farm equipment processing. And then we take that remaining, now lightly processed natural gas to run these gas reciprocating engines on location. So again, powering our frac operations by burning natural gas, cheaper field processed natural gas.
Yeah, well, you're also taking trucks off the road, less emissions. You're more safety, because
exactly.
I'm sure when you look at safety as a CEO, driving is probably your top concern. I think it mostly is the road.
Top concern by far.
Yeah.
And Jeff, I know you've dedicated your career to safety, and God bless you for that, because we work on location near high pressure iron. These are producing energy, like producing anything else, has trade-offs, and safety is definitely an issue. Our industry is I think thought of as dangerous, and people die all the time. And 100 years ago, that's not untrue.
Yeah.
50 years ago, or even oil and gas production, remote operations today in poor countries, it's a dangerous game. If it's done by, modern Western companies over there, if it's Chevron in the jungles of South America, it's going to be done pretty damn safe and pretty small environmental impact. If it's a local state-owned company in a poorer country, it's a lot more cowboy. It's a lot bigger environmental impact. It's a lot more dangerous set of operations. But yes, in our industry here domestically in North America, the safety has it's been a one-way street of 100 years of dramatic improvements in safety, to the point where, to your point, Jeff, where by far and away the most dangerous thing in our operations is driving, because people are driving in pickup trucks to go to location or to the work site. High diesel trucks are coming to fuel our equipment. So to your point, if we can power it with field natural gas and there's no truck driving up on location, that's a safety impact. That's a clean air impact. That's a less resources impact. So people think of us as like the destroyers of the world. Now, we do increase greenhouse gases. Like most manias, there's always a kernel of truth. We increase greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. They absorb infrared radiation. Like, of course, the core of that, are we going to, on the margin, warm the planet by what we're doing and powering the world with hydrocarbons? Yes, is the answer to that. Then the question is, what are the trade-offs for that? And again, we talked about those doubling of human life expectancy and wildly better quality of life. Those trade-offs are usually worth it. Are compellingly worth it.
Yeah.
But in our operations on location, technology, process, training of people, we can continually make it safer and safer and safer to work on oil and gas locations. And to you and I, it's deeply personal. There's over 5,000 employees in our company. That's my extended family.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody in the Liberty family going home in a worse condition than when they arrived. I want them a little prouder, a little bit wealthier for the money they earned that day.
It's 5,000 people in an oil field. That's 3,600 that are actually wearing hard hats, that are actually in danger. So that's a lot of people to worry about. Yeah, and it's a system, and I think most of America has no idea how complex the oil and gas extraction or the energy extraction model is. I mean, I didn't know it because I never worked in it till I got into this field, and it was amazing. And so was the safety part. I mean, the safety, all that has changed drastically. I mean, we're talking about driving, so we're talking about saving lives, dying, but other injuries as well. We're trying to keep that people from, carbon monoxide, keep their eyes and heads from getting blows, their fingertips on, things like that. And we've done that. It's the recordable injuries on fingers since the impact glove was invented or pushed into the market is 90% lower for that, and things like that. That matters as well, because this is a HSE podcast, not just energy. But last question I'll have for you. You may not be able to talk about things, but in the future, is there something coming down the road for Liberty that you're extremely excited about that you can talk about, or is it something that maybe you can't talk about just yet?
Well, the majority of our technical innovation, even going back to our quiet fleets or early dual fuel fleets, it's slow and gradual. To make a robust system different than it was before takes time and investment. It took us 2 years to develop how to make frac fleets quiet. And so this conversion from diesel to natural gas, that was a multi-year technology development effort. And now it'll be many years building new equipment, retiring old equipment, transformation over. But we are every day working on, software tools for decision making. Hey, this truck's about to fail. Why don't we pull it out now and change the rods out before we throw a rod? We're routing trucks that are delivering sand on safer routes or lower traffic routes or more efficiently, shorter drives. Pull from a different mine when you're going there and switch this detachment from there. So that's like we call it Uber for sand. So there's a whole bunch of technologies, that are often incremental advancements. Sometimes they're step changes when they get rolled out. One of the things we're looking at in our technical team is today, when we're producing oil and gas in a field, we're getting out, 7 to 10% of the oil underground. 7 to 10%. It's still a giant amount of oil, but most of it's still there. So we got pilot tests and working with some of our customers on how do we get more of that oil out of the same place we're already producing from. This, the default ideas are injecting ethane, sort of a lightish hydrocarbon in there to give more mobility and change the surface tension factors on oils. It could also be CO2. You inject CO2 underground. That's an enhanced oil recovery technique. It's an old enhanced oil recovery technique. But if we're going to get a larger pipeline infrastructure moving CO2 for underground sequestration, instead of just sequestering it, we can use it for beneficial use. So I think in the next 5 or 10 years, the industry today looks dramatically different than it did 10 years ago. And I think it's safe to say 10 years from now, it'll look dramatically different than it does today. Cleaner, better, more efficient, and larger. Demand for oil is at a record high today. Demand for coal is at a record high. Demand for natural gas is at a record high.
It's expected to keep rising too. Like there's nothing, when they factor in all the changes, the demand for oil and gas is still there. It's still growing the same as the rest. Well, I know we're short on time here, so I'm going to just end the conversation here. I guess one of the things that was maybe most exciting to talk to you about was when I first read your ESG report, saw some of the things you were saying. I think on the outside looking in, and I've told you this before, oil and gas needed advocacy, and they needed correct advocacy, because most of it was just people over here who were highly motivated against oil and gas. They had their scheme together. They had their ideas together. They had the communication out there, and they were in all avenues of communication. And oil and gas people were just sitting there doing work and trying to take care of business, and they weren't. There was never a good response. There was never a sober, intellectual, thoughtful response to why it's important and and the biggest thing is what you said, the trade-off. what are we willing to actually trade off? And you've spoken ad nauseum about that. Is that it would be detrimental for us.
And Jeff, one thing I want to say, because I often get thanked for being an oil and gas advocate, and a small technical correction: I don't ever play the role of oil and gas advocate. Yeah. I'm an energy guy. Oil and gas is like the fourth energy area I worked in. My goal is not to promote oil and gas. It's just to promote facts and sobriety around energy and those trade-offs with climate change. I'm in favor of all energy sources that help better lives. You know, I mean, I'm the first signatory of a letter of oil and gas executives endorsing nuclear. We've got like 60 executives there. We want to get to 100 top executives in our industry. That's not good for our business to endorse some energy thing, but we don't care about that.
Country.
We want to be the honest, sober people. There's so much noise and silliness and crazy alarmist stuff in the energy world. Our goal is to be the honest, credible people in that space.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate very much your time today. I know you're a very busy man, but I think you talk about everything. But if I appreciate you taking a moment to talk about the safety and environmental side of your business, and with us at the Mission Zero podcast. And maybe in a couple of years, I look forward to catching up with you again.
I look forward to it, Jeff. Appreciate what you do every day.
Thanks,
Take care.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and accept the mission. Please subscribe to the Mission Zero podcast on your preferred streaming service, and be sure to give us a 5-star review.